Welcome to Mind Yourself, a podcast sharing real life stories from real people, alongside conversations about mental health and emotional well-being. Listener discretion is advised, as this episode may include themes some listeners may find distressing. Wherever you're joining us from, whether you're walking, driving, or taking a quiet moment for yourself, you're very welcome here. Let's get started. So today we welcome Alan Dignam onto the Four Swans podcast, Mind Yourself. So Alan is a psychotherapist here at Four Swans, and he's also a lecturer at IICP. And Alan's going to tell us his personal and professional experiences of neurodiversity and sexuality. So you're very welcome, Alan.
Thank you.
Can you take us back to your younger self? What was it like for you growing up?
Yeah, growing up, a couple of different kind of stages that kind of come to mind when I reflect back over my younger self. I suppose big pieces for me was like moving when I used to live in Malahide. I moved to Drogheda when I was about 5. I was in senior infants at the time. So there was that shift and move and fitting in and trying to find my place in school, like at that stage. I'm thinking then as well of like going from primary school to secondary school, again, fitting in was a big challenge for me, and finding my space, finding myself, all those kinds of aspects of it. And then I think what maybe kind of added to some of the challenge of fitting in and finding my space with that move was that my parents had separated. So that was part of the reason for the move. So I was moving between Drogheda and Malahide the whole time, like at weekends, for example, to spend time with Dad and those aspects. So it was really, I wasn't around my peers at the weekend to make those friendships, to make those connections, to make those, build that community around myself, I suppose. So there was that aspect, but then in secondary school as well, I really struggled during that time frame in secondary school. There was some bullying that I experienced that was quite harsh to get through, I have to say. But during that time frame, trying to discover myself then as well. My sexuality was one aspect of that. I think my peers had kind of figured out my sexuality long before I had. Or had really kind of come out to myself, which I say is the first person you have to come out to, is to yourself. And so that piece was quite a challenge for me at that stage as well. Looking back on it too, I question my neurodiversity at the moment, and the more I look into that, I'm kind of exploring that for myself. So I suspect I definitely have dyslexia. Could never spell, but I seem to do relatively well in school. But yeah, that spelling aspect was just always alien to me, and reading aspects was a challenge at times. And as I've gone on in my later life and more in adulthood, I'm kind of questioning around ADHD for myself as well at the moment. And it's actually through my clients I've learned that, which is interesting. Then coming in and saying, "Oh, I have a diagnosis of ADHD, and and because of that, I'm doing X and Y." And I'm sitting there and like, do we not all do that? Is that okay? Maybe I need to look into this for myself. That's very familiar to me. So there's that experience as well. But going back to the childhood aspect, there was I kind of placed myself around that school age time, and that was a real challenge for me, kind of figuring out who I was, finding my place. All of those things was quite a struggle at that time.
So you're talking about your teen years being the particularly difficult time, and you mentioned there being bullied. How did those experiences shape the person you are today?
Ooh, so because I'm a therapist, done a lot of therapy, so there's a lot of experience or trying to figure that out. But even still, that feels like a big question at times. I think it's certainly made me a chronic people pleaser in one aspect. I'm always trying to feel accepted. I'm always trying to feel liked. I'm always trying to feel that I fit in. And the best way to do that is to be needed, or to be liked, or to be wanted to be around. So all of those aspects really kind of play into it. I didn't really have much friends back at that time in school. So that kind of followed through my life, I think, trying to find those people to connect with. I have, and you know, in my adulthood, I've made those connections, and I've come to maybe a small group of friends as opposed to loads of friends, but on a very deep level. I've developed that connection with some people, and that's kind of where I'm at with it too. I think as well, like around some of that aspect of trying to become okay with myself, trying to become, I suppose, because I felt so much rejection during my early stages and during childhood and teens in particular, trying to accept myself first of all, and realize that I am acceptable by others, was a huge piece. And there was an element of going to therapy for myself during my teens that helped me kind of discover my identity and helped me figure out who I am. And it's part of why I became a therapist myself later in life. It took a while to figure that out for myself, but there was elements of that back when I had, when I was in therapy at 15. It certainly played a role along the way as well.
So you are a full-time psychotherapist today and a lecturer in psychotherapy as well. Do you think that was shaped from your own personal experience of therapy? Do you think that's what inspired you to become a therapist, or what was, I suppose, the journey to becoming a therapist?
Yeah, so yes and no, I suppose, is what I would say to that. So when I was in therapy as a teenager, I remember having the thought at the time about I could sit in that other chair, thinking like, what would it be like to sit in my therapist's chair at that time? And I think I would like to do that at some point. Ultimately, done my Leaving Cert, went to Dundalk College. I trained in software development, so very far removed from being a therapist. And I worked for 13 years in the IT sector. Like that was my career at the time. But during that time frame, I suppose there was a couple of things, I suppose. Before that, I had kind of contemplated, when I was 15 about becoming a therapist, but part of what I was being bullied about was my voice, how it sounded. I noticed people in school would come up to me and ask me random questions just to hear me speak, and then would go away laughing once I answer whatever question it was. I remember one instance of actually being recorded in class, and my voice being replayed, and so it was quite a humiliating experience at that time. But I suppose the reason I'm naming that was I had this fear of talking to people, which is ironic considering what I'm doing even right now on a podcast. I'm speaking out to the world, right? But there was that element at play. So I remember when I was in therapy at 15, wanting to be a therapist or thinking I might like to be, but then I was like, but then I'd have to speak to a lot of people, and I'm not sure how I'd feel about it at that time. But as I went on, as I say, in my IT career, I remember I could do the role. I wasn't very passionate about it, but I was capable. And I was like, is this it? Is this what I'm going to do for the rest of my life? And I was really questioning that. And there was a certificate course that was on. It was a couple of Thursday evenings after work in a college nearby in where I worked. And I was like, oh, sure, we'll do this. And it's an introductory course. And worst case scenario, it's something to just add to my CV. It's in psychotherapy. Let's see what it's all about, kind of thing, and go from there. And for me, it just went from certificate, it went to a diploma at the time, went on to a degree, went on to master's, and now I'm doing my doctorate. So be careful what you wish for, right? So that was part of the journey for me as well, was along the way to become a therapist. But equally, I wanted to offer something back to clients that I felt I had at the time. I had that space to go to be comfortable, to be safe. And the first person I ever said out loud to that I'm gay was my therapist at 15. Wow. I got to say it to myself first at some stage and realizing it, but outside of myself, the first person was my therapist. And I always remember that moment because when I said it to him, he turned around to me and he said, I could see that was really, really difficult for you. You're after blushing as you said it. And I just remember feeling so seen in that moment, just not just from a physical side, but just as like, I finally get to say who I am. I finally get to accept who I am in this moment and be accepted for who I am by somebody else in that moment. It was so powerful. And yeah, that meant so much to me. So again, being able to offer that on some level to others, I think was part of why I wanted to become a therapist as well.
What would you say to someone who feels like their identity is something that they have to hide?
Yeah, first of all, I'd say is I get it. I can understand why, or at least on from my own experience, I can relate to why we might want to do that. And sometimes that's necessary depending on the situation, as in it may not be safe, it may not be comfortable. Like, as long as you don't feel that it's okay and safe to do so, that it's okay to protect yourself if that's what you need to do. At the same time, if that's not how you want to live your life, if that's not how you want to be, finding however small a space for yourself, whether that be the likes of therapy, whether it's the one close friend, whether it's a stranger that doesn't know you and doesn't know anything about you, finding one space that you can be your authentic self and potentially share that with somebody like me in my therapy when I was younger. I think it's such a different feeling. It's such a different way of being, to be able to be your authentic self in that moment. And if that's possible for the individual that does feel the need to hide or is not comfortable sharing themselves, if they find that for themselves, how liberating that can be. But I respect at the same time, sometimes we just don't feel we have that space. But I think through the likes of therapy and that, sometimes we discover maybe there is a space we just haven't considered, or there is a space that maybe it's not as scary as we think it might be. Or if it doesn't go the way we would like it to go, there's ways we can maybe try to figure out how to manage that or handle that for ourselves. But yeah, try and find something somewhere, I think is really important for us as well, to that decision of, are you going to live your life not as your authentic self? And for some, that may be what has to be, but it's such a challenge. It's such a challenge not to be who you are. I think as humans, we're born to be who we are supposed to be, and to not be able to do that for whatever reason, it's so constricting, and so it holds people back so much, I think, as well.
And just going on to the topic now of neurodiversity, and you shared there that you suspect for yourself that you may have ADHD and dyslexia. From your personal and your professional experiences with neurodiversity, what are some of the misconceptions that people have?
I think, and I think even for myself, like, I would have had these misconceptions, again, like I say, before I started to suspect for myself from people sharing, and particularly my clients sharing with me. There's this maybe one image we have of what neurodiversity might be for ourselves, or the media portrays certain aspects of what neurodiversity might look like or how it might be represented. And realizing that it is very much a spectrum across the board. That I remember one person saying to me that if you've met one person with autism, or you've met one person with ADHD, you've met one person with that. It's not that you have a sense of what it's like for everyone, or what it might look like, or how everyone might experience it. So our own individual experiences, I think, as well, is something to reflect on. But I think as well with neurodiversity that, well, I would say there's a crossover between neurodiversity and sexuality. I think you learn to mask yourself in the sense of just to fit in. You learn to be a certain way. You learn to operate and to present yourself in a certain way to fit into the masses, to fit into society, to culture, whatever it may be. And as a result, like, that's happening from a very early age. And as a result, we may not even recognize we're doing this, because it's just so normalized, so default, so automatic for us as we go along, that we don't realize that we're actually not being our authentic selves. And I think that's a huge piece that, a lot of people don't necessarily even realize this is the thing. It certainly was my experience. I just thought this is the way life is. And the more I'm starting to realize, well, not everyone necessarily experiences life the way I do. And that's not to say that I would necessarily perceive that as my life is bad or difficult, or, yes, there might be elements that I'm challenged by, or I find isn't as easy or smooth for me to do. So I'm thinking again with my dyslexia, for example. So it's not that I can't read, it's just that I might take a little bit longer to read the same passage as the person beside me, or something to that effect. But equally, I think with the change in, you know, technology and society, like, you don't necessarily have to read a book now, you can listen to it. So there's all these different options available to us as well. We have spell checker now as well, which I live by. And even with that, sometimes my spelling's that bad that spell check can't figure it out what I'm trying to say. So that can be frustrating, but, you know, you find your ways of dealing with it. But I think with the misconceptions though as well is that it's not going to be obvious for everyone. And I think this is why we're seeing a lot of late diagnosis for adults now as well. The people have lived their lives to a certain point and it's only now realizing, well, actually, maybe there is something I need to just check out here for myself. Whether that's necessarily then to seek medication or to engage in therapy or not, I think there's a huge piece of self-identification and understanding ourselves, that this is why I experience X and Y. My brain works in this way. And that explains. And I think there can be a huge relief in that for people, in the realization, I'm not broken, I'm not damaged, I'm not somebody that just cannot figure life out like everyone else around me seems to be just sailing through it. There's something going on for me, and as a result of that, doing life in this path is not so streamlined for me. So maybe it's about, well, what's a parallel path that might work for me? Or just accepting that, okay, there's certain aspects in life that might not be so straightforward. And sometimes that feels a bit shitty. And sometimes it's like, okay, I can just get on board with this. I can accept this for myself. And at least I can understand myself and have a bit of self-compassion, that if I'm arriving late to something, if I'm, you know, struggling with my time management, if I'm whatever it may be, it's like, okay, that's just how I operate, and I'm not going to beat myself up every single time that happens.
Alan, you've built a very successful psychotherapy practice. You're actually now based here full-time at Four Swans. You've mentioned before that you think there can be fear among therapists sometimes when they're working with members of the LGBTQIA plus community. Where does that fear come from, do you think, and how can it be addressed?
I think for most people that I've spoken to, like, I've delivered trainings on that specific aspect before, and then as a lecturer obviously as well, talk a lot to students about it. I think a big piece around that is the fear of getting it wrong. There's a lot of therapists out there that are well-meaning, well-intentioned, but are afraid that they'll say the wrong thing, or they'll make things worse, or something along those lines. So therefore, I'm going to step back from working with the community. And it's like, I don't want to offend, I don't want to upset. So it's easier to just step back and not offer therapy services. And I think what we see, like, particularly in some of the research I'm doing for my own doctorate at the moment, but it leads to a situation where there's a lot less therapists available for a minority community. So in this case, the queer community, for example. But I think what's important to note is, while yes, there's additional training that can be done, yes, there's, you know, maybe becoming a little bit more familiar, and I say this to people, to become familiar with maybe the terminology and language that might be used within the community, but no more so than somebody who's coming from a different community that you grew up in. You know, so somebody that came from another country, can you work with them or not? Because their experience is different. And you know, sometimes there might be just too much of a disparity, and I know that, but that's the rare occasions. So it's the same for working with somebody from the LGBTQIA plus community. That, you know, you don't have to have had the same experience, or similar to, I'd say to people, like, do you have to have been depressed as a therapist to be able to sit with somebody with depression? Yes, there might be a nuance you're consciously aware of that the client may not need to explain. But if you haven't had that experience, of course you can sit with them. If you can sit with somebody, if you can be compassionate, if you can offer that empathy, if you can, those baseline things we're taught as therapists to be able to do, they're all still relevant for anybody, I would say, regardless of what their background is. So yeah, there's those elements.
And Alan, you've mentioned that not all struggles regarding sexuality or neurodiversity are because of identity, and that our identity, though it's important, it's not the only lens to be able to see a person through. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I suppose the first thing that comes to mind around that when I think of it is that I have a lot of clients that say this to me in their own experience as well, that they may have gone to other therapists before, or even just other people in their lives that are trying to support them or help them. But it's not to assume that the person that's coming into therapy, who happens to be a gay man or a trans woman or whoever they may be, that all of their challenges in life is because of their identity. It may very well be, it may not be. The same way I would say to, the students that I teach is like, if a pregnant woman came in and sat in front of you and said that she was depressed, you wouldn't automatically assume that her depression is because of her pregnancy. It may very well be connected in some way, but it's not to make the assumption. It's to do the inquiry, to check out, where's that coming from? What is the depression about, etc. The same with a client who comes in from the community as well, is what I would say there. So it's offering those different lenses and layers of who the individual is. And I remember there was two quotes that really stick out to me from my research in my master's, where I was speaking to members of the community, LGBTQIA plus community, who were going to therapy, and asking them what was it like to be in therapy. And one of them was saying, it's like, well, being gay is not all I am, it's just one part of me. Again, I would argue that for any client coming through the door, that whatever element we're aware of, that's just one part of who the client is. And another quote that really stands out to me was, we need to remove this idea that straight is the default. Straight is normal, sorry. We need to remove the concept that straight is normal. Everything is normal, straight is just common. I thought that was a lovely way of putting it, that yes, whatever the commonality is in people, but at the same time, each of us will have our individuality along the way. But it's not to look at our individual clients through only one lens. We as humans are very complex, right? We have lots of different layers, lots of different aspects to ourselves. So ensuring those layers come in to the therapy space, and we're viewing our clients through multiple different lenses as a result. Another piece that does come up, I think, and maybe just going back to a previous question as to what therapists might need to know. So how do I say it? I suppose it's this idea that there's a big piece of having to educate our therapists when somebody from the queer community comes in and sits with a therapist who's not from the community or not part of the community themselves. Now, again, I argue that as therapists, we cannot necessarily have the experience or 100% knowledge of every single community or every single background. Absolutely not suggesting that. But the idea that when somebody comes in, particularly from the queer community, and they're sitting there, or I would argue from the neurodiverse community as well, that we don't expect our clients to educate us on everything about that community. We absolutely need them to explain their individual experience, but maybe we need to go off and do a little bit of research about some of the terminology that's used, or what's the common experience or the generic kind of experience within X community that the client may belong to, so that we're educating ourselves just a little bit around that. So going back to that fear I was mentioning earlier on of sitting with somebody and getting it wrong, like, that's okay. That, like, so if we're well-meaning and we get it wrong, it's okay. Clients are generally forgiving of that. And if a client absolutely wants a therapist who is, really knowledgeable in an area, they will seek that therapist out. If they're sitting with you and they're returning, there's something in the therapy they're happy to continue with. So lean into that. But at the same time, maybe we do a little Google search when we get out of the session about, upskilling a little bit, or even just a little bit of knowledge on X or Y term that was used by the client that we're not overly familiar with. So I think they're important bits to know too.
Alan, you've shared today that you started your own therapy journey when you were 15. How has being a client over the years shaped how you show up as a therapist yourself? And maybe what have you learned from other therapists who don't share your identity?
As far as I'm aware, not all therapists have declared this, but I've never sat with a queer therapist as a client, and I'm not aware of sitting with a neurodivergent therapist as a client. Now, I'm aware as well that therapists don't necessarily disclose those things, and they may very well have been present for some of the therapists I've sat with, just wasn't declared, so I'm not aware of it, as I say. So I make that kind of declaration before I say anything else. But I've certainly had the experience as a gay man sitting across from a straight female therapist and trying to explain what my experience is like. And for the most part, that's been understood. But there has been moments where that has been missed. And, you know, that can feel like, well, here I am yet again in a space that I'm not understood, or yet again, you know, not fully. I never felt unaccepted, but just the understanding can be a little bit off at times. And again, there was no malice in that, no badness, no ill intent. But I'm also aware that happened during my therapy training, where I was attending therapy as a trainee therapist. So I had a sense of how it was supposed to work and what was supposed to go on. But at the same time, I'm thinking of some clients that may be a little bit more vulnerable or less aware of what therapy is supposed to look like. What about if this is the person's first time in therapy? All those aspects. So that comes into my own work then, and that's really shaped how I am as a therapist, because I want to be able to recognize for people that, you know, everyone's individual experience of therapy is going to be their own individual experience. And as a therapist, I'm aware of that there's different modalities. Like, I don't know, there's 400 or 500 different modalities of therapy now. It's no therapist is going to know all of them, but I'm able to offer a few of them, I say, or a few options around that. So again, offering the ability to tailor therapy based on what the client needs is really important, because again, each of us will need something different. And going back though as well to, you know, there's that aspect of having to come out, I suppose. Like, each therapist I've sat with, I've had to come out to them, whether that's just in passing comment or whether it's necessarily connected to what I want to be talking about in therapy. That's another element. And I think in some sense we all have that coming out process about something about ourselves in therapy. You know, whoever we may be. But for some, it's more of a natural occurrence, or there's an assumed default, perhaps, in, you know, whether it be sexuality or being neurotypical, for example, it would be another aspect. So if we aren't within those realms and having to name it, that can be challenging, or it can be a case of, oh, here I am again having to explain myself, and that can be quite difficult. Like, as you guys know, like, somebody just coming through the door for their first therapy session to begin with can be a huge thing to do, and then they sit down and having to explain who I am, or actually, no, I don't have a wife at home, I actually have a husband, or, you know, that element. It's like, I'm here to talk about what's really challenging me, but I'm trying to also get you on the same page of just who I am to begin with, can be an added layer to that. So I think as well, going in with the least amount of assumptions, and being aware of my own frame of reference. And I'm not here to say that I'm the perfect therapist, far from it. I think we all have our limitations in different aspects, and how we work as humans, we have them, right? So it naturally translates to our work. So I think holding that in the mind as well, that our frame of reference is really where we're operating from as therapists, and that may not translate to where the client may be. I see it as well, like, you know, sex and sexuality coming into the therapy room. I think just from an Irish culture, it's such a taboo topic. We don't have the language around it. We don't have the experience of being able to talk about sex and sexuality in an open and frank kind of conversation, it's very rare for us to be able to do that. So as a result, sometimes I even notice it when clients come into me, they're either wanting to bring something in and they're being very hesitant around it, or they're checking my level of comfortableness around the topic of sex or sexuality as the therapist. They're checking that with me. Before they name anything, they want to make sure I'm comfortable with it. And that's if they're even willing to even put it on the table for discussion. Sometimes they're not. And sometimes we as therapists need to bring it up because our client just cannot. And when I've done that with clients in the past and put it on the table and, like, you know, is this a part you would like to talk about? Particularly if somebody's coming in and talking about their relationship or anything like that. Yeah.
So thank you very much for sharing your own personal journey. And so looking back to that, your younger self, your 15-year-old self who was being bullied, if you could speak to him now, what would you say to him?
Oh, yeah. I think recognizing, I can feel the emotion already as I'm even just reflecting on this. I think recognizing the level of resilience that I actually had to endure what school was like, to endure what it was, that aspect of, 1,000 cuts versus one incident as such when it came to bullying. So there was never any major issues as in massive situations. It was all these little minor things that just everyday experiencing. So being able to be resilient enough to endure that, to get through that. And there was one day where I refused to go to school in secondary school. I could not go in. I could not. I had reached my limit at that point, and it was from there that my parents got me into therapy, and I was lucky that that was an option. But to get through that, but also to realize what I was bullied for is actually my passion now, is what I do for my career. I have embraced. So being bullied around my voice, to be bullied about who I am. Here I am talking about who I am on a podcast. I use myself as a therapist. I use a piece of self-disclosure. I use my experience as a therapist. I share elements of myself with my clients. Not a whole lot, but just small pieces that would be therapeutically relevant. I'm using my voice. I'm teaching the next generation of therapists as they come along in Ireland. And I'm also using my voice for other members of the community now. The research that I'm doing, my doctorate, is for the queer community as well, and neurodiverse community. It's the intersection of those two communities is what I'm researching. And I'm putting that out there. I'm using what I was put down for, or what I was singled out for, or what I was a target for back in the day. And I'm using that not just for myself, but for others. But it's great that I'm able to do it for others, and there's that aspect of it, but there's a self piece in that as well, that here I am being able to do that, being able to put myself forward in some way, and to have built that confidence to be able to stand in front of a room of students in a lecture and speak and share, and to be able to impart that knowledge, and to offer, okay, it's not a school, it's a college, but to offer a classroom environment that is safe for anyone, regardless of their identity, to come into, that I didn't necessarily feel I had that in the school setting. So being able to offer that in the classroom, but also then offer that in a therapy space where somebody can come in and be their authentic selves and get to just be for that period of time in the session, if that's what is necessary in that moment, and to just be heard, and so to be able to take those things that people chose they didn't particularly like about me or wanted to target about me when I was growing up, to be able to transfer that into my strength, into my power, into what I'm made a career out of, it feels like quite a switch around.
You've made a really successful career.
Thank you.
You're also very happily married now,
yes,
to Paul as well. What do you try and instill in your students then beyond the theory?
I think it is about that experiential piece, and particularly, like, I'm teaching the sexuality module a lot this year. I have a couple of cohorts of students that I'm teaching that to at the moment, and again, I use myself in that. I use my own coming out experience. I use all of those things to maybe just transfer the humanity of it. I had a teaching assistant in one of my classes recently, and they shared a piece of their personal story. Obviously, I won't share that here, but the students' reaction to that was, thank you for sharing that, because it's a piece outside of my own experience that I can't share from myself. So the students were saying that it humanizes the theory. It turns the theory aspect into, well, here's somebody talking about the actual experience of that. It's no longer this abstract kind of concept or a theoretical or hypothetical kind of aspect. It's now a real person with a real experience and real consequences and joy and all of the different elements that come to it. So I try to instill that in students. So while, yes, we touch on the theory, of course we do, that's needed, but at the same time, it's the humanity behind the theory I think is really important. And I think within therapy, that's a huge piece, that ultimately it's two humans, right, sitting across from each other. Theory can help, it can give us a framework, it can give us a structure, all of those things. But at the end of the day, I think most people just want to be understood or heard or accepted in some capacity. Because for a lot of people in therapy, that's why they're in therapy, because they either can't understand themselves or they don't feel understood by the people around them. I think most issues that come to therapy can be boiled down into some capacity of that.
And in modelling that to your students, it can help them to recreate that then in their own therapy spaces.
Absolutely. And look, I'm aware as well, like, you know, how much of ourselves we share as therapists is going to be very individual. And again, depending on which of the 400 or 500 modalities we work in, you know, the theory will have a different take on how much of that is relevant or not. But yeah, I think as therapists, the biggest tool, for the one I use inverted commas there, but the biggest tool we have within our therapy toolkit is ourselves. And that's the key aspect. Everything else is just an add-on after that.
And anybody who's listening who feels like they'd like to come to Four Swans and attend psychotherapy with Alan, they can just come onto our website and we will be able to allocate you to Alan. So finally, Alan, we ask everybody the same question. How do you mind yourself?
So with difficulty at times, I'll be very honest in that. I think sometimes people assume therapists have it all worked out, right? And, you know, we have our lives figured out. And sometimes that's not the reality.
We definitely
don't. But amongst that difficulty in juggling life and work and everything else that comes with it, for me, what I do is I'm part of a local dance group. I've danced on and off over the years. And that's just a passion of mine that I like doing. I've never done it any competitions or anything like that, far from it. It's just for fun. It's to release, you know, energy and to let go of whatever has been stressing me out over the recent times. Generally not clients, just want to put that out there in case they're listening as well. But more from the academic side of things, or deadlines, or, you know, whatever it may be. But yeah, so I dance a lot, and it's not just about the physicality of that. I've met a lot of really good friends through dancing as well, and, you know, people that we've stayed in touch, and we meet up and we socialize together and all those kinds of different things. So it goes beyond just that, you know, maybe 1 hour a week, for example, or whatever it may be for a dance class. But again, there's that piece of putting myself out there, right? While I don't compete, I've gone into shows and, you know, a performance in that self. So putting myself in front of an audience yet again. So maybe there's a trend developing here, right? But aside from that, it's, you know, I'm doing all the usual things then that we talk about. You know, I've gone back to trying to look after myself in relation to movement and exercise and food, etc. But I also recognize, as somebody definitely, I suspect ADHD, that's bloody hard, because consistency, like, I go through spurts of I focus on X and this is a great way of maintaining, and then I lose interest very quickly, and once I've lost interest, I'm done with it. I'm moving on to something else. So when we're trying to have any level of consistency with looking after ourselves, that can be a challenge. Ironically, the dance has somehow managed to win out in that. I'm fairly consistent with that when I'm in a dance group. But outside of it, it can be hard. And I think that's really important to note, that whatever people do to look after themselves, give yourself compassion with that as well. That do it as much as you're able to do it, and absolutely engage in it. But let's not beat ourselves up on the moments when we don't get to as well. And I think that's another way of minding ourselves, I would say, is that compassion. If we're too rigid with what the self-care is supposed to look like, it's no longer self-care. It's a chore. It's another to-do list. It's another task. And I question at that point the level of self-care we're able to give to ourselves through that task if we don't necessarily want to do it. Don't get me wrong, I don't necessarily enjoy going to the gym per se, but I feel better afterwards. So there's those pieces too. Sometimes we need to just show up. But there will be moments where we can't show up, and it's okay to let those go, as long as we're trying again the next day.
That's a really important message. Thank you so much, Alan. Thanks for coming onto the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
That is it for today's episode of Mind Yourself. If something in this conversation has resonated with you, share it with someone who might need to hear it, because these are the conversations that matter. Don't forget to follow or subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you're enjoying the podcast, a quick rating or review really helps us to reach more people. So until next time, mind yourself.